Cairo Riverboat Boneyard, Illinois, August 1882. The air hung thick and wet, a shimmering curtain of heat that smelled of mud, coal smoke, and decay. Here, on the alluvial flats where the Ohio River surrendered to the Mississippi, the age of steam came to die. Skeletal paddle wheels, stripped of their buckets, leaned like broken water lilies. Hulls, scoured of their paint and gingerbread trim, lay half swallowed by the silt. Their names, Southern Belle, Comet, River King, fading into the grain of their sun-bleached planks. It was a place of endings, of salvage and surrender, which made the sight of Václav Hořejší so peculiar. He wasn't stripping a boat, he was furnishing one. For weeks, the men at Greer Hollister's riverboat yard had watched the Czech carpenter. He had claimed the wreck of the Delta Queen's Ghost, an 80-foot side-wheeler, whose boilers had gone cold a decade prior. Now it listed in the mud, a permanent resident of the boneyard, but Hořejší treated it not as a wreck, but as a foundation. With a quiet, methodical rhythm, he hauled load after load of sand from the riverbank, dumping it not onto the shore, but into the vessel's cavernous hold. "He's filling it up," said a yard hand named Silas, leaning on a stack of salvaged cypress, "as if it ain't sunk enough already." Greer Hollister, owner of the yard, and a man who understood the precise value of every bolt and plank in this graveyard, watched from his office window. He saw not eccentricity, but a problem, a squatter. "It's madness," Hollister said to his ledger, where the Ghost was listed as salvage property, collateral against a shipping company's debt. "The man's a fool. He's building a house and a tomb, and he's doing it on my property." The mockery on the riverbank was a low hum of certainty. The man was crazy, trying to live in a beached boat. He'd be frozen or flooded out by first frost. What did this Czech river shop carpenter, a man who built livable wagon boxes in far-off Bratislava, understand about hull mass and sand ballast, that a man who owned the entire boneyard, a man who had built and salvaged these vessels his entire life, had so completely missed? This story is about more than just an unusual house. It's a lesson in forgotten physics, in the wisdom of outsiders, and in the profound difference between a structure that merely blocks the wind and one that holds the memory of heat. I promise by the end of this story, you will understand the incredible thermal power locked inside a simple pile of sand. If you appreciate stories of ingenuity against the odds, consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever repurposed something old for a completely new and surprising use? Václav Hořejší was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, nor a housewright in the American tradition. He had arrived in St. Louis 5 years earlier with a set of skills that seemed, on the surface, ill-suited for the raw continent. In his homeland of Bohemia, under the Austro-Hungarian crown, he was a wagon bedna craftsman. He worked with the bones of retired transport, old railway cars, decommissioned river barges, freight wagons put out to pasture. His trade was not to build from scratch, but to transform. His hands knew the language of reinforced frames, of weatherizing hull planks, of finding living space within the rigid confines of a structure built for cargo or travel. He could look at a freight box and see a bedroom. He could look at a grain barge and envision a warm, dry workshop. To him, a vessel's retirement was not an end, but a change in purpose. He found work in the bustling steamboat yards of St. Louis, his skills with wood and sealant proving immediately valuable. He saw the magnificent Mississippi steamers not as romantic vessels of passage, but as enormous, floating wagon bedna. He patched their hulls, repaired their staterooms, and learned the unique ways they fought and yielded to the river. But the work was transient, and the promise of steady employment drew him, his wife Agnieszka, and their two small children, Jan and Marie, downriver to the great nexus of Cairo. Their first winter there in 1881 was the crucible. They rented a standard clapboard shack, a box built of thin planks and frontier optimism. It was a sieve for heat. The cold that rolled off the confluence of the two rivers was a living entity, a predator that seeped through every crack. Václav, who had known the deep, damp cold of Central Europe, had never experienced anything like this. It was a dry, aggressive, invasive cold that didn't just chill the air, it changed the very state of matter. That winter, he watched the physics of failure unfold in his own small home. The ink bottle on the small writing desk where Agnieszka wrote to her family in Bohemia did not simply freeze. It grew a fantastic, crystalline spike of inky frost from its rim, a black icicle reaching for the cold air. One morning, fetching the mule's tack, the thick harness leather, made brittle by the ceaseless cold, snapped at the stitch as if it were a dry twig. It hadn't been stressed or pulled hard. The cold itself had broken it. The potatoes Agnieszka had carefully stored in their root crock, meant to last them through February, had not just spoiled. They had cured into gray, uncookable stones, frozen solid in their bin. The family slept in their coats, huddled together, the wood stove glowing a furious red, but providing only a small circle of habitable space. The heat it produced was fleeting, radiating out through the thin walls as quickly as it was generated. Václav burned through their winter woodpile by January and spent the rest of the season trading his labor for scraps of coal. He knew they could not survive another winter like that. He needed not just a better stove, but a better house. A house that didn't just fight the cold, but held the warmth. The failure of conventional frontier construction in a place like Cairo was not a failure of craftsmanship, but a failure of thermal philosophy. The cabins and shacks that dotted the riverbank were built as envelopes, designed to keep wind and snow out. They were single-layer shells of wood, often with uninsulated attics and crawl spaces. The problem wasn't the quality of the lumber or the skill of the carpenter. The problem was a fundamental misunderstanding of heat itself. Heat, on the prairie, was seen as a product, something you made constantly with a stove. The American obsession was with bigger, more efficient stoves, potbellies, box stoves, furnaces that could consume cords of wood and tons of coal. But the house itself was a passive bystander in this process, a leaky bucket that could never truly be filled. The heat produced by a stove, primarily radiant and convective heat, warmed the air and the objects in its immediate vicinity. But the structure itself, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, remained cold. The moment the stove died down, the stored heat in the air dissipated in minutes, leached away by the cold mass of the building and the countless paths of infiltration. Václav's neighbors, the O'Malleys, lived in a constant state of thermal panic. Their cabin was well built by local standards, but its stove was a ravenous beast that had to be fed every hour, day and night. Mrs. O'Malley once told Agnieszka that she hadn't seen her windows clear of frost for 2 solid months. The interior was perpetually coated in a thick, opaque rime. They lived in a 4-foot radius around their stove, the rest of their small home a landscape of Arctic misery. The problem wasn't their stove. It was their house. It had no thermal mass. It had no heat battery. This was the term Václav used in his own mind. He knew from his work on Vagon Bedna that a structure needed to do more than block the wind. It needed to breathe in heat, hold it in its very substance, and then exhale it slowly over time. A thin wooden wall could no more hold heat than a paper cup could hold the heat of a blacksmith's forge. You needed mass, you needed substance. The frontier cabin was a tent made of wood. Václav intended to build a fortress of warmth, and its foundation would be a material the boneyard had in infinite supply: sand. The very earth that was trying to swallow the dead boats would be used to give one of them a new, warm life. He began his project in late August, when the heat was still oppressive. He chose the Delta Queen's Ghost for specific reasons. Its hull was mostly sound below the waterline, and its position in the mud was stable, unlikely to shift. Most importantly, its main saloon deck, with its tall windows and relatively intact roof, sat high and dry, a promising candidate for living quarters. His first task was to make the vessel his own. He ignored the ornate, rotting superstructure of the Texas deck and pilot house, focusing on the core of the boat. He descended into the dark, musty space of the engine room. The great boilers were cold and silent, monuments of rust. He didn't try to remove them. That would be impossible. Instead, he worked around them, using brick and mortar he salvaged from a collapsed chimney to seal off the entire boiler chamber. The cavernous space, now dry and secure, became his larder and workshop, a space immune to the dampness of the river. Then came the true labor. He cleared the main hold, a back-breaking task of shoveling out years of accumulated silt, river debris, and rotting dunnage. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but with each wheelbarrow of muck he hauled out, he was creating a void, a space to be filled with his secret weapon. Day after day, under the relentless late summer sun, Václav moved sand. He didn't use a mule or a cart. He used a single wheelbarrow and two strong arms, a silent, relentless procession from the sandy bank to a simple gangplank laid against the ghost's flank. The other yard workers watched with a mixture of pity and amusement. They saw a man engaged in a nonsensical Herculean task. He was deliberately making the boat heavier, ensuring it would never float again. "He's burying it," Silas chuckled to a friend, "saving the river the trouble." Václav paid them no mind. He built a simple, low bulkhead of thick planks inside the hold, creating a contained area that ran the length of the main hull. Into this space, he poured the sand. He didn't just dump it. He spread it, leveled it, and packed it. He worked until the sand reached a uniform depth of 4 feet. It was a massive undertaking. By his own calculations, he moved more than 200 tons of sand, one wheelbarrow at a time. It was during this phase that Greer Hollister made his official visit. He strode down the muddy bank, his boots making sucking sounds in the silt. He stopped at the gangplank, his face a mask of stern ownership. "Hořejší," he called out, his voice sharp. Václav emerged from the hold, covered in sweat and dust. "I've let this little project of yours go on long enough. You're squatting on salvage. That hull is on my ledger, an asset of the Cairo Riverboat and Salvage Company. Come the spring survey, the company's lien will be executed. We will have you and this sand pile out on your ear." The threat was clear. This was temporary, a fool's errand that would end in eviction. Václav wiped his brow with the back of his arm. He looked at the powerful man, then at the half-filled hold, then toward the hazy line of the Kentucky shore. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Spring is a long way off, Mr. Hollister," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Then, without another word, he turned, picked up his shovel, and went back to work. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows from the skeletal remains of the other boats, Agnieszka brought him his dinner. She stood on the saloon deck, which he had begun to clean and repair, and looked down at the immense quantity of sand filling the belly of their new home. "It is a strange house, Václav," she said, her voice holding no judgment, only observation. He looked up at her, at the concern and trust in her eyes. "It will be a warm house, Agnieszka," he promised. "It will be a warm house." To understand what Václav Hořejší was building, you have to think about heat, not as a fire, but as a fluid. Imagine pouring water into two buckets, one made of paper, the other of thick, dense sponge. The paper bucket holds the water for a moment, then it leaks out, gone forever. The sponge, however, soaks up the water, becomes saturated with it, and will release it slowly for hours if you just leave it be. A conventional frontier cabin was the paper bucket. Václav's steamboat hull was the sponge. The principle he was employing is called thermal mass, and his medium was 456,000 pounds of ordinary Mississippi River sand. Let's break down the science. Every material has a property called specific heat, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature. Water has a high specific heat, which is why a large lake stays cool long into the summer. Sand, with a specific heat capacity of 0.99 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit, is surprisingly effective. While not as good as water, its density makes it a phenomenal heat battery. A cubic foot of the damp, packed sand Václav was using weighed about 95 pounds. His sand ballast was 4 feet deep, approximately 15 feet wide, and ran for nearly the entire 80-foot length of the hull. This gave him a total volume of 4,800 cubic feet of sand. At 95 pounds per cubic foot, he had created an artificial deposit of over 456,000 pounds of thermal mass directly beneath his living space. The card's calculation is elegantly simple. A single linear foot of this ballast, a 1-foot wide slice of the sand, could absorb and store 21,000 BTUs of heat energy. This meant that the entire sand bed had a theoretical storage capacity of over 1.6 million BTUs. It was a thermal reservoir of staggering proportions. The system worked in a simple 2-stroke cycle. During the day and for a few hours in the evening, Václav would run a small, efficient wood stove in the main saloon. A significant portion of that heat, radiant heat from the stovepipe and convective heat in the air, would not escape through the roof. Instead, it would be driven downward, absorbed by the thick oak planks of the saloon deck, and crucially, by the colossal mass of sand beneath. The sand would slowly charge, its temperature rising degree by degree. Then, when the fire died down for the night, the second stroke began. The air in the cabin would begin to cool, but the sand, now warmer than the air, would begin to release its stored energy. It would slowly, gently radiate its millions of BTUs of heat upward back through the floorboards. This wasn't the harsh, direct heat of a stove. It was a steady, silent, radiant warmth that came from the entire floor. The calculations suggested this exhale of heat could last for more than 30 hours, easily bridging the gap from one firing of the stove to the next. This system was made possible by the boat's inherent construction. The double-hulled design of a classic riverboat, with an outer layer of planking, an air gap, and an inner layer, provided a natural insulation value of roughly R12. This was vastly superior to a single plank cabin wall. The insulation acted like a good lid on the sponge bucket, keeping the stored heat from leaking out the sides and bottom into the frozen mud. The warmth had only one place to go, up into the living space. Václav hadn't just filled a boat with sand. He had engineered a passive heat release system, a massive, slow-burning ember made of earth itself. The cold arrived in the second week of December. It didn't creep in. It fell like an axe. The locals called it ice gorge cold, a specific and dreaded phenomenon. It began with a hard north wind that scoured the heat from the land. Then the temperature plummeted, not just to 0, but to 10 below, then 20. For 9 consecutive days, the thermometer in Cairo did not rise above minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. The great rivers, the engines of the region's life, seized up. The Mississippi, a mile wide at the confluence, froze over, its current choked by a vast, groaning jam of ice sheets. The pressure was immense. Along the boneyard, the sound of the ice gorge was a constant, terrifying chorus. Deep groans as the floes ground against each other, and sharp, cannon-like cracks as the immense pressure found a weakness, snapping 40-foot mooring pilings as if they were matchsticks. A thick, sub-zero fog rose from any open leads of water, clinging to the dead boats and coating every surface in a layer of feathery, crystalline frost. For the people of Cairo, it was a battle for survival. In the O'Malley cabin, the fight was desperate. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the stove glowing cherry red around the clock. Yet, the corners of their single room remained lethally cold. They draped their blankets over chairs to create a small tent around the stove, a tiny island of life in a sea of Arctic misery. Their water barrels were frozen solid. To get a drink, they had to chip ice and melt it, a constant wearying chore. Inside the hull of the Delta Queen's Ghost, life proceeded with an almost uncanny normalcy. Václav fed his small stove for 2 hours after dawn and for 3 hours in the evening. The fire was never roaring, just burning steadily, charging the sand battery beneath the floor. When the stove was out, a profound quiet settled over the space, but the warmth remained. It was a different kind of warmth, not the scorching heat of a stove, but a deep, pervasive, radiant comfort that emanated from the floorboards. There were no cold spots. The air was still and calm. One evening, on the 5th day of the deep freeze, Agnieszka went to the small, polished sideboard they had salvaged from the boat's own fixtures. On it sat a bottle of plum brandy, a Slivovitz from a recipe her grandfather had taught her, a reminder of Bohemia. She uncorked it to pour a small glass for Václav. The dark amber liquid poured in a clean, smooth, aromatic stream. It was perfectly liquid, cellar-cool but not cold, its complex fragrance unimpeded by the frost that was shattering harness leather and freezing inkwells all across the town. In Greer Hollister's own fine, brick-built house on Washington Avenue, the ration of whiskey on his desk was a solid brown plug of ice. To get a drink, his servant had to take a hammer and chisel to it. The children, Jan and Marie, were not huddled by the stove. They sat in the middle of the expansive saloon floor, playing a quiet game with a set of carved wooden blocks. They were in their shirt sleeves. The gentle, radiant heat rising from the floor made the entire room their playground. Agnieszka could knead bread on the large oak table in the center of the room, far from the stove, her fingers nimble and warm. The sound inside the hull was one of peace. The soft click of wooden blocks, the murmur of his children's voices, the rustle of a page, as Václav read a book. Outside, the world was cracking apart. On the morning of the 7th day, at the gray edge of dawn, Greer Hollister was in a heavy wooden survey skiff, poling his way through a narrow, steaming lead in the ice field that had once been his boatyard. With him was Silas, his foreman. They were assessing the catastrophic damage. The ice gorge had been merciless. 3 of his main piers were shattered, and a dozen smaller boats had been crushed or torn from their moorings. Hollister was encased in layers of wool and canvas. His thick beard was a solid mass of ice, and the fleece ear flaps of his cap were frozen stiff. Every breath was painful, the air so cold it felt like swallowing needles. He was a man of power and substance, the owner of all he surveyed, and he was freezing, miserable, and counting his losses in the tens of thousands of dollars. As they poled past the static, silent form of the Delta Queen's Ghost, he looked over, expecting nothing. He expected to see a tomb, its windows opaque with the thick, feathered ice that signified a dead cold interior. He expected the silence of surrender. He saw something else entirely. The tall saloon windows were not frozen. They were clear, beaded with a light film of condensation on the inside. A sign not of freezing, but of a significant temperature differential. A sign of life. And then he saw the man. Through the glass, in the soft lamplight of the early morning, Václav Hořejší stood before a small polished mirror he had affixed to a stateroom wall. He was in his shirt sleeves. A puff of steam rose from a ceramic basin on the table beside him. With a steady hand, he was calmly drawing a straight razor down his cheek. Shaving. The image broke something in Greer Hollister's mind. The sheer, impossible contrast burned itself into his brain. Hollister, the master of the river, freezing half to death in his own yard, bundled like an Arctic explorer, while the fool Czech squatter performed the most mundane of civilized routines in shirt-sleeve comfort. The world, for a moment, turned upside down. Power, money, and conventional wisdom meant nothing in the face of the brutal physics of the cold. All that mattered was what worked. "Mr. Hollister, you all right?" Silas asked, seeing his boss staring motionless at the wreck. Hollister didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the impossible scene of domestic peace inside the frozen hulk, the chasm between his reality and Václav's wider than the frozen Mississippi itself. 2 days later, the cold finally broke. The temperature climbed to a balmy 10 degrees. Hollister, without sending a foreman or a message, walked down to the ghost himself. He found Václav outside, reinforcing a section of the upper deck railing. Václav saw him coming and simply nodded, waiting. "Hořejší," Hollister began, his voice different now, stripped of its arrogant authority. "I saw you. During the freeze, you were shaving." Václav nodded again. "It was Tuesday. I shave on Tuesdays and Saturdays." Hollister was speechless for a moment. He looked at the boat, then back at the man. May I see the inside?" "Of course," Václav said, and led him up the gangplank. Hollister stepped from the muddy, frozen shore into the saloon. He braced himself for what he expected to feel: the damp, musty chill of a beached hull, the smell of mildew and river water that permeated every wreck in his yard. Instead, a wave of steady, silent, deep warmth washed over him. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a wood stove. It was a gentle, radiant heat that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air was fresh and dry. He took off his thick gloves. He ran his bare hand along the wall. It was cool, but not cold. Then, hesitantly, he bent down and placed his open palm flat on the wooden floorboards. They were warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch. The sensation was so alien, so contrary to a lifetime of experience, that he felt a jolt of pure awe. He looked up at Václav, his face a mixture of confusion and profound respect. The simple, quiet man had not just survived the ice gorge, he had defeated it utterly. Hollister stood up, his mind racing, connecting the sight of Václav hauling sand with this impossible warmth. He finally understood. The sheer mass, the stored heat, the slow release. It was genius of a kind he had never encountered. He looked around the comfortable, livable space, at the sleeping children's cots in one corner, the tidy kitchen area, the bottle of plum brandy sitting on the sideboard, its contents clear and liquid. He looked at Václav Hořejší, the quiet immigrant carpenter. "My God, man," Hollister said, his voice barely a whisper. He shook his head in wonder. "You didn't build a house. You built a summer." Greer Hollister was a businessman, but he was also a riverman. He understood practical results. The lien on the Delta Queen's ghost was forgotten, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. He became Václav's most vocal advocate. He brought other yard owners and riverboat captains to the hull, letting them place their own hands on the warm floor and feel the impossible truth of it. The story, backed by the unimpeachable credibility of Hollister himself, spread up and down the river. Hollister, a member of the board, arranged for Václav to meet with the editor of the Mississippi River Pilots Association Quarterly Journal. In March of 1883, the journal, a practical, no-nonsense publication for working rivermen, ran a 3-page article titled On the Conversion of Retired Hulls for Winter Habitation. It featured 2 detailed diagrams drawn by Václav on Hollister's own drafting table, showing the sand ballast principle, the ceiling of the boiler room, and the recommended stove placement. The idea, now codified and distributed, took root in the practical minds of the river communities. A beached hull was no longer just a source of scrap lumber. It was a potential home. By the autumn of 1883, the article had borne fruit. 4 other beached boat dwellings rose from the mudflats between St. Louis and Memphis. Near Vicksburg, the wreck of the Natchez Firefly was converted by a former ship's engineer, and in a boneyard south of St. Louis, a family took up residence in the hull of a decommissioned tugboat. The technique was adapted and modified, but the core principle, Václav's principle of thermal mass, remained. Václav Hořejší, with river mud and sand, had created a passive heating system that anticipated the language of modern building science by nearly a century. What he built was, in essence, a massive low-tech version of a trombe wall or a phase-change thermal storage system. He had intuitively grasped the concepts of heat capacity, slow release, and the critical pairing of thermal mass with an insulated envelope. He didn't have the vocabulary of BTUs and R values, but he had a deeper, more tangible understanding forged in the workshops of Bratislava and the freezing cabins of the American frontier. The story of Václav Hořejší's Steamboat house is not about a grand invention or a stroke of revolutionary genius. It's a quieter story about the transfer of knowledge. Václav was a craftsman applying his trade to a new set of circumstances. He looked at the graveyard of the steam age and saw not endings, but opportunities for transformation. He saw the hull of the Delta Queen's ghost not as a dead thing to be harvested for parts, but as a vessel with one final vital cargo to carry. He didn't build a cabin on the river. He taught a retired boat to keep his family in the only job it had left, the job of shelter, the job of warmth, the job of home. If this story of ingenuity taught you something about the hidden potential in the things we discard, please consider subscribing for more tales of historical innovation. Give this video a like to help us share it with others, and let us know in the comments. What's the most clever example of repurposing you've ever seen or heard of? We'd love to hear your stories. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and an understanding of thermal dynamics. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be undertaken in full compliance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.